Yeah, I'm Gordon Gow. I'm a director for Media and Technology Studies at the University of Alberta. This is as I said yesterday, this is my second time with the Indigenous Connectivity Institute. I was at the Indigenous Spectrum Summit earlier in the year in Nanaimo. I have among my research interests and teaching, I'm actually quite interested in spectrum and how it's been shaped over the years by policy and different positions. So today's panel is on spectrum advocacy, and the question is, are we headed in the right direction? So just to set the stage, it's important to remember that radio spectrum it's an invisible resource that exists everywhere all the time. We don't often pay attention to it until our phones don't have connectivity, and then we become aware of it. But it is very important to connectivity, especially with the technologies we're using today, both in terms of fixed wireless and mobile service. And today, as we'll learn, I think, from Tricia on the panel also, that traditional terrestrial broadcasting uses spectrum, and that remains in rural and remote communities still a very important part of their connectivity. And so what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the challenges. We have a terrific panel. We have Lope here. We have Jonathan at the end, and we have Tricia. I'll let them introduce themselves and make a brief opening statement, and then we'll go through. I have some prompts here, but we'll see how the discussion unfolds and go with, see where the winds blow us. Okay, why don't I begin with you, Lope, to introduce yourself and make a brief opening statement. Thank you.
Okay. I stand with deep respect on the unceded land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation in Ottawa. My name is Lope Trujillo Perdomo. I am Colombian, but also I am Canadian recently. I have been working in this field, bridging the digital divide for the last 30 years in my life, always focused on rural and remote communities, indigenous communities. And for the last 10 years, we have been working, documenting and creating a product with the best practices in Canada for rural connectivity to bring that technologies and regulations and innovations to South America, to do the same and to change the law, to change the framework of regulation, to make easier to connect remote and rural First Nations there. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, there. Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. I just want to begin by thanking the event organizers. This has been a really amazing conference. My name is Tricia Toso. I'm here representing Alfred Loon from EU Communications Network. He really wanted to be here and sends his regards. I'd also taking this opportunity to represent Scott Forward with the James Bay Cree Communications Society, who they run the regional network up in EU-ISHTI. Together, these organizations have built both broadcasting and broadband systems across EU-ISHTI in northern Quebec. And so while spectrum access for cellular services has only come into focus in the recent decades, First Nation radio broadcasters have been navigating these license barriers since the 70s and 80s. So really what I want to emphasize today is that spectrum access, whether for radio or mobile, is the backbone of Indigenous language revitalization, community safety, and self-determination.
Bonjour, Anin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonathan Fleury. I am here with Norway House Cree Nation to speak about some of the stuff that we're doing. Norway House is located about 800 kilometers north of Winnipeg, just on the very edge of Lake Manitoba. It's one of the largest First Nations in Manitoba. It's also one of the most progressive. We just completed our all-fiber network. We just built a brand new hospital. And also we are looking at advancing our technology in the spectrum and the wireless world, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I just also too want to acknowledge the elder, our hosts, and our MC as well. And I also just want to give a little shout out. I know my mom is watching, so hi, Mom.
Okay, thank you all. Why don't we begin with the fundamentals and talk a little bit about access? So the question that I'm going to put to you, and why don't we begin with you, Lope? How well is Canada's current spectrum licensing system serving Indigenous and remote communities, and where are the most significant gaps or challenges?
I can start telling that the work that Canada has been doing is remarkable. Canadians, I learned Canadians used to be very self-critics, too much. Canadian used to say only bad things about Canada, but when you, like me, have been living for a long time in the worst conditions that in Canada used to live, it's shocking for you because Canada, when we arrived here, Canada was 98% of penetration in fixed internet access in remote and rural regions and places. This is remarkable, being Canada the second largest country in the world. In Colombia, for example, we have 116 indigenous nations with 60 different languages, and we have 95% of unconnected. Only 5% of them have internet access, any kind of internet access. So that's a huge problem. So, but now, because that forum is to talk about spectrum, how we are doing right now about that, I can say that we are going in the wrong direction because we are putting all the focus in the high frequencies of the spectrum. And when you are talking to create a new infrastructure to connect people that lives in the rural and remote because there is their land, there's where their identity are, talking about high spectrum, high frequencies is the wrong way. You have to think in the spectrum that document is amazing. I strongly recommend to read it. It's very easy to read. If you think about the spectrum like a drum, the external part of the drum, I was looking for a drum, but I can't find it. So, but the external part of the drum is the high frequency. And in the center of the drum is the low bands, the low frequency. If you want to have a strong sound, strong resonance, that capable to go across the walls and reach many people in this huge building, you have to hit the drum in the center, right? Because in the center is where the strongest frequency, because the wave is huge and can go across forest and can go across mountains and reach 75 kilometers around from a single one antenna. So when the regulator in Canada and US and everywhere is talking about inclusion or reconciliation and start talking about high frequency, Indigenous people have to take the control of the conversation, of the negotiation, and put their interest or the focus on the low spectrum. Because that's the key, that's the sweet portion of the spectrum. And the big players know that, and that is because they don't want to share that section of the spectrum. Big players want to hoard all that spectrum, even if they are not using it. So we want to work. We achieved that goal in Colombia last year. After 8 years working, fighting, we changed the framework. We have the law for the people, Indigenous people, can use in a free way that spectrum for their communications and build and own and operate their own networks. So this is because I think that sadly we are going in the wrong direction right now.
Well, here in Canada, we've actually seen some really interesting developments on the telecom side in terms of spectrum. We've seen the ISED introduce a framework for Indigenous priority window. We've also seen the local non-competitive licenses introduced and the use it or use it policies. But there are some gaps and different ways that we can strengthen those tools. One thing that we would, of course, like to see is that the Indigenous priority window eventually include low-band spectrum, like 600 or 700 megahertz, and not just like sort of high-band leftovers. Of course, we want to see the application processes simplified so that they don't demand expensive engineering studies and financial guarantees, as well as providing legal and technical support for communities so they can actually be successful in their applications. In terms of the local non-competitive licenses, we'd like to see that scaled up, and that can allow Indigenous applicants to combine adjacent license areas to cover their traditional territories, as well as reserve portions of new bands, such as a 3.5 gigahertz for local non-competitive licensing allocations. And then, of course, for the use it or lose it, we would like to see it, enforceable with shorter timelines. Some of these licenses are 20 years. So, we don't want to sit around and wait 20 years to see if the incumbent is going to use the spectrum. And if the spectrum is reclaimed, we would like to see it to be prioritized to First Nations operators in that region. It's just a few.
Miigwech, I completely agree with did you read my notes? I'm just kidding. So I completely agree with what my panelists have said, but also some of the progress that we noticed is the attention that the government is paying into this space, literally paying by investing some money into this. Primarily, you need the infrastructure in place in order to utilize the spectrum. So the government, I've seen in two frames, one investing in backhaul. Norway House Cree Nation has entered into a partnership with its neighboring community, Pimichikamak, to create a backhaul company called Kitchissippi, which means Big River. And this is a jointly owned, all Indigenous. We built it ourselves, we designed it ourselves, and we're operating it ourselves. And this is in northern Manitoba. And that could not be done without the investment from the federal government. In addition to that, on the spectrum side, and I see Mr. Saunders and his team is here today, the fact that the Canadian government has developed this team, which in and of itself is very, very helpful and very useful in that regard. And that's some of the progress that's being made. With my colleague here on the use it or lose it, I completely agree with her, because in those proposed areas, they're still underserved. And the reality is that spectrum sits unused in these communities, and while we're not being connected, and the system still favors big carriers because it's costly, it's complex, and it's not really designed for nations, because once we get the spectrum, then what? So that's really where we're at. But
thank you very much. So some themes are starting to emerge, but let's talk about, and we touched on a little bit in that first round, but models. So we've talked about access, and in terms of access, thinking about different frequencies and different frequency bands. Lope and Tricia both mentioned that, and then thinking also about capacity to use spectrum and to apply for it. But so getting into that, what promising models for Indigenous spectrum access, whether that's exclusive licensing, shared access, community allocations, Should Canada be looking to adopt more of or expand to increase access for Indigenous communities?
Okay, we think that Canada must expand or have to expand the Indigenous priority window to low band frequencies. We are talking about 500, 900 megahertz. Up to 1 gigahertz is very good. It's very useful, of course, but always needs line of sight. And if you need line of sight, that amazing document says, you will need more capital, more investment to replicate new towers, many towers, and it's unnecessary. It's too much. It's too expensive for Indigenous communities and most for the territories with the low population density of population, right? So that bands 500, 900 megahertz offer unmatched advantage. We are covering right now in Colombia 4 million acres from one single antenna with no line of sight. When we started that process 8 years ago, our regulator, the Ministry of Telecommunications in Colombia, and the ANI, National Agency of Spectrum, reacts telling that was an unconstitutional use of the spectrum. But right now we have the law, we have the regulation, and we can do the same here in Canada using the TV white space regulation that is open, but is not too much useful because was made for a kind of radius. We are talking about very expensive radio with low power that can achieve long distance. Are not useful for rural, but the law is very useful. With a little bit improvement of that law, we can use that law to achieve that coverage and that speeds. We are providing 50 megabits per second real speed with no line of sights and in distance like 75 kilometers around. So I think that this will be maybe do a little small adjustments to the actual regulation to use the 500 megahertz. To go to the 900 megahertz, we have to work stronger, but it's very useful for use IMT frequencies for the where there are nobody providing service. We are ending a pilot in Colombia using IMT 900 megahertz, and it's very useful. The people use their own SIM cards, programmable SIM cards, and can create links, connection with no line of sight from 10 kilometers and 15 kilometers from the BTS. It's very useful for small communities in the jungle in Colombia, in the west coast of Colombia, using IMT frequencies. But right now we can start with 500, changing a little bit the law for TV white spaces.
A couple of things that I can think about is one is perhaps create sort of a dynamic sharing regime where idle spectrum that is licensed by large telcos like Rogers or Bell can be shared with First Nations, of course, with rigorous frameworks in place to make sure there's no interference. We would also really like to see standardized subordination rules. So if we could have like a published model with terms that require national carriers to offer spectrum sharing with fair conditions, because right now they can dictate prices and technical aspects of it as well. And then thinking about in terms of radio, like community or social licenses, that can create a permanent category with nominal fees that allow for linguistic and cultural public safety broadcasting. And then finally, also the potential for micro licensing for temporary sites, so when there is, hunting camps or seasonal or emergency use, that's available as well.
Just to add on to what was already said, it's in from my point of view and our perspective, to answer that question is in threefolds: affordability, enforcement, and transparency. Because access means nothing if it's not affordable. So licensing fees, admin burdens, and they're barriers to nations who want to participate in the Canadian economy. The use it or lose it must be enforced because, again, spectrum sits unused while our communities remain disconnected. And there also needs to be transparency on who holds the spectrum and how it's being used and where are the gaps that remain in terms of that, because nations like ours want to be able to provide this service and actually need this service because we still use our traditional lands for hunting, fishing, trapping, and we need to be connected in that. And it's not just a way of life, but it's also a safety thing for us as well, because, and then we want to continue on with that for our next generation, for our children and our grandchildren and the next generations to come up. So that's really what we're thinking about and how we want to be able to utilize these technologies.
Thank you for that. I want to pick up on a point here around capacity, and so maybe I'll ask you, Jonathan, just to elaborate a little bit. You mentioned affordability, transparency, the enforcing the use it or lose it. Where are we at in terms of the capacity, technically, legally, financially, to advocate for some of these changes? And where do we need to go in terms of becoming more effective?
Well, that is a really good question because as a nation, when we first started down this road around spectrum, there wasn't a team at the government level where we could turn to and really walk us through, because I don't know if you've ever filled out any government form. It's really complicated, and even with the brightest minds, it's really complicated. And especially if you haven't really participated in this space before, particularly because it's not designed for Indigenous engagement yet. And I say yet because I'm very hopeful that that's going to change, because what happens, at least in Manitoba, is that in order for a nation to get cell service, we have to pay for the tower, we have to pay for the infrastructure, and then we have to pay for the services. So that's really the deal that the big companies, and I'll call them big three, and I'm not going to name who they are. So it really leaves us out of that space, but we're just like everywhere else. We're coming we're coming for the air. So, but in terms of capacity within our nations and within our people, because we all want cell service. Like you mentioned, we don't have cell service, or when we only care about it when it's gone. So educating our youth, educating even our elders on what this exactly does this mean, because we just don't want the service anymore. We want to be part of the Canadian economy and benefiting off of this, because we're not just consumers, we're also owners of this. And so with that in mind, we're moving towards that, and that's how our model is.
Yeah, well, in EUHT, the Cree they have great technical capacity. They have built a fiber optic network that services 14 communities, 9 Cree and 5 Quebecois. And they're also right now unrolling a cellular network. By 2027, they'll have 46 towers that extend service over all the highways, access roads, trap lines, and mining corridors. Currently, they offer cellular services in all the communities. But the issue has been spectrum. In 2019, they participated in the federal auction for 600 megahertz, and they only lasted a few moments before they were priced out. Later, they got access to 800 and 1900 megahertz spectrum through a licensing agreement with Rogers. But there are issues with the subordinate license. I mean, it does, the long-term growth depends on access beyond subordinate licensing. So there's issues around renewal, pricing, technical terms that depend on the parent licensee. So it's difficult to deploy a long life network when you don't have spectrum that you actually control. And on the radio side, yeah, the JBCCS has been in operation since 1981. And they do have quite an extensive radio network. But recently they've really come up against a roadblock at the CRTC because they want to relicense as native type B radio. And because there's been a proceeding that has been looking at the renewal of the Native Broadcasting Act, that's sort of been frozen. So they sort of can't access the funding as well as turn up their transmitters to have a wider coverage. So there's issues. They have capacity, but the issues are sort of on the policy side at the moment.
Sorry, I think that maybe the problem for the spectrum equity start because not many people knows about the spectrum. When you talk with IT leaders, leaders in communities, even in companies, even in government, you can note a huge lack about spectrum. Spectrum is a weird thing. Just a very small group of experts can talk about the spectrum like a mystery, it's like a myth about the spectrum. We have to do stronger efforts to teach about communities. I'm talking about communities, about ICT leaders into the First Nation communities, because we need that everybody knows what that means and what important is for the project, because you can have a lot of dreams about IoT in your territory, putting sensors in your territory for agricultural, for animals, for weather control. But if you don't know how to provide the connectivity using the spectrum, you don't have the capability to do that. All that dreams stop when the spectrum says stop. First thing that we need is knowledge. We have to provide knowledge to communities. We start that in Colombia in an alliance with universities, have been very useful. And now we are starting here with Concordia University and Alberta University also, and even with the Indigenous Connectivity Institute and First Mile Consortium to do the same here. Because the communities needs to know to have a good skill for negotiate the spectrum, and of course financial support. But we are talking about a small amount of money. We are talking about less than $50 per square kilometer covered. If you calculate that amount of money, is very cheap. You can cover in that using low frequencies. You can cover huge territory with a very small amount of money. But the people, the communities needs support from the government for the CapEx. After the infrastructure is deployed, they can't work to make a sustainable model. To deploy a sustainable model in the time, but the CapEx had to come from somebody, from government or from foundations, private foundation. We are working with industries in Colombia, huge industries. Inter-American Bank of Development, a few years ago, spread the notice that the main risk in the risk matrix for an infrastructure project is the social protest in Latin America. For a road, for a hydroelectric project, or for gas, petroleum companies, they have to avoid the social protest even before they start their project. So now we are working with them, trying to create a commitment with the community, and they are open to invest in infrastructure, in internet, to provide the internet of all that communities around their projects. And we are in charge of develop the market, develop the skills among the community to make it sustainable in the time.
Thank you. I want to follow up a little bit on this. Lope, you said knowledge, and I'm hearing that when we're thinking about advocacy, there's obviously working with policymakers, but getting the community on board and building the capacity and that knowledge. Where do we go? And knowledge building in this area is complex because you have technical knowledge, you have knowledge in terms of the legal and policy advocacy role. Where does that sit in the community now? Does it come from outside the community? And what, in terms of thinking of the next 5 to 10 years, where do we look to build that capacity, that knowledge that will enable these advocacy efforts to make the most on these different fronts? Even beginning with just the technical knowledge needed to put a case together to apply for Spectrum. Sorry, Lo. It's probably me. It's not you. It's me. I'm sure it's me. So you mentioned knowledge. I guess my question is, how do we develop that knowledge? Can that knowledge be developed in the community? It seems to me it's a multi-generational task to build this knowledge. We have to work outside. You have to work outside of the community to bring experts in, but you also have to look at building that capacity. And it's legal, it's technical, right? And it's social in the sense that you have to understand how to be a good advocate and what strategies you need to develop.
I can start off here. First and foremost, when you're talking about capacity and that knowledge base is, and I've always advocated this amongst our youth, and hopefully some of our youth, they seem very, very interested in this, but training in engineers, we really need those engineers to come in and provide that, because within Norway House, as big as we are, our population is on reserve is 10,000 people. We have doctors, we have lawyers, but we don't have engineers to do this. So we have to outsource that. How do we outsource that? I mean, how do we bring that back to the community? Well, events such as this, including our youth, having them participate, because I can guarantee you they don't teach Spectrum in school.
Except in my course.
Except in your course, yeah. But you have to pass high school for that. So with that in mind, like just getting them exposed to technology and the intricacies and how it works and that to be able to provide the services, like for example, doing an application for Spectrum is it's quite complex, and you need that legal framework, you need that engineering, technical background, and that's something that's not necessarily homegrown. That's something that we have to outsource. That's something we have to send our youth out to go and get that education and build that, and then bring it home. And then even when you bring it home, you have to pay them. You got to make sure that there's work for them, because if there's not, then guess what? The big three companies are going to take them. And then we're right back to where we started. So my friends here talked about capital expenses. That's part of the conversation that needs to happen with the government, and really only the government at this point, because they're the regulators, they're the funders, and they're responsible for all of that stuff as well.
So, Tricia, I want to just jump in very quickly. You mentioned the James Bay Cree, and it seems to me what I'm hearing is there's actually a lot of capacity with James Bay Cree. Is there coalitions that can be developed between communities where that knowledge can be shared, and where you can build on the knowledge that exists out there and connect others to it?
Yeah, actually, this kind of addresses a little bit the panel I'll be on tomorrow around workforce. Yeah, in EUHT, they've been quite successful in training outside plant, like field technicians. So people who are working on fiber installations, towers, logistics. The challenge has been really for finding personnel for the network operations centers, so that's the engineers and IT specialists that can monitor and manage the backbone. So that's still a really big challenge. Can there be coalitions? Absolutely. I mean, I think that's just a really, I think that, that has a lot of potential for across Canada, events like this can really bring people together. I think that there's, yeah, a lot of work to be done there. But yeah, it's great to see so many people in the room that are interested in it.
After all this time working on creating change, disruptive change in different communities, we have learned that when the right people in the community have the enough motivation and believe in the dream, they don't need a deep understanding, a technical understanding. For example, me, I'm not engineer. I just an advertiser. And after a while working as a creative director, I decided to change my career because to change, looking for something more significant, looking for something meaningful, change lives. And I have been a little bit successful. Sorry. We have been creating 3 companies and sold it. We have sold it. So, but I still, without all that deep knowledge, I only have the practical knowledge. I can understand what that means, that we have to looking for, and move forward. Bring with me in this journey the right people, of course, from the academy, from the government, everywhere are good people to work with them, open to work with you in this purpose. And I'm sure in every First Nation in Canada, you can find the right people to teach them the basics, the practical knowledge, and to create a movement. I don't know if in Canada it's the same, but in Colombia, indigenous people are very well organized. If something works in some region, all that news spread very, very fast to other indigenous groups in Colombia. So we are hoping, we are working hard to do the same here, and all of you have the invitation to work with us, join us with ICI to do this. Looking for the right people. All depends of the right people. People with enough motivation, with fire in their hearts.
Great, thank you. So what I'm hearing you say, Lope, is sometimes having a strong champion in the community is really the starting point, because they're the ones that can really bring the effort together and bring in the experts and play that facilitating role in building up the capacity in the community.
I'm not using the word champions because when you say champions of the community for ICT, many people used to think and the young the young guy that is capable to learn pretty quick about computers and about technology. But sometimes you have to have a group starting with elders. Maybe they never will have the skills to do the technical stuff. But if you find an elder with the fire, that elder will be key for your effort. Just because that elder have the authority, the knowledge, the wisdom, everything to still the fire burning. And that elder can teach you where you can find the young people among the community to create or to find champions, ICT champions. So, but it's a group.
Okay, we're just about at time. So why don't we wrap up with the future outlook. And we'll start with you, maybe, Tricia, to think about looking ahead 5 to 10 years. What would success look like for you in terms of Indigenous spectrum policy advocacy in Canada?
Well, I guess the first thing is to see all the Cree highways and roads fully covered by mobile service, as well as have the Cree language alive on radio and digital platforms. We would also like to see Indigenous spectrum allocation normalized in Canadian policy. And then also improved resiliency. I think the 2023 wildfires really demonstrated, some of the gaps in some of the networks. So we really want to see resiliency improved. Because that's really about public safety. I think that's it.
Few things for 5 years, very achievable goal. Backbone connection via fiber or LEO satellite or millimeter wave links, but always every community with a point to spread or to take a link to the backbone, because that's where everything starts. Having a point of connection with the backbone. Low band spectrum access, of course, that I'm saying all in my participation today. Grants for CapEx from the government. Cybersecurity tools to protect data sovereignty and cultural integrity, because internet is the main cause for the death of the ancient and ancestral cultures. Epistemicide. We don't want to do that with newborns and internet. We don't want to use internet to kill ancestral cultures. So we think the Indigenous people need include in cybersecurity strategies the protection of their culture. Not only about their data, not only about their private information, it's about their culture. This is a key thing about cybersecurity for Indigenous people around the world. An empowered young leading ICT with vision and skills that I'm talking about. With a strong knowledge, a strong conscience about the value of their local perspective, the local culture, have a universal value. Most of the young people don't understand properly how important it is to preserve their culture, the language, because they say if we only are thousands speaking the language, what is the goal? What is the meaningful to learn the language? Every day we are losing language in the whole world. When a language dies a culture with the language. So we need the young people in Indigenous communities have conscience about that and use the technology to protect and spread that culture, because that culture is a treasure for the whole humanity. And now with internet, we can use that tool to bless the humanity with our local cultures.
I would like to mention that the future in regards to not only just spectrum, but really technology and connectivity, but focused on spectrum, that Indigenous nations are recognized as spectrum rights holders, not just stakeholders. And this goes back to our treaties that were signed, because the treaties, if you study them, they're within the depth of a plow. Anything below and up that is ours, really. So idle spectrum to be reassigned and used by Indigenous operators. And dozens of thriving Indigenous-led networks, like our friends over across the Hudson Bay from us, delivering affordable work services. Norway House is also a gateway community, because on the inland side, on the east side of us, there's about 40,000 people. There's about about 10 other indigenous communities that can piggyback off of our backbone and utilize our networks. So then that's something that I really need to talk to Alfred about and the team at EU about. And because we're out there, also policy frameworks that embed spectrum sovereignty into law, and also to practice that as well. Because success means indigenous communities are in control over their digital futures and not waiting for the big carriers to come, because I'll be old and retired by the time and still waiting if they come. So I feel that we're moving in the right direction, because that right direction is indigenous sovereignty, not only over spectrum, but over connectivity and technology. So now it's about turning our policy promises into practice and making sure that communities have the tools that we need in order to participate and not just survive, but thrive in the Canadian economy. And that's really what it's all about. Thank you, Migach.
Thank you. Very well said, Jonathan. I think with that, we'll wrap up the panel. I will, if I can reach over here, Lope, I give a plug for the ICI's Spectrum Explainer series. If you haven't seen this, it's a good starting point to get your head around what spectrum is and why it's so important. And I think each of our panelists did a terrific job today, bringing to us different perspectives and really giving us a sense of the fullness of this area and the kinds of issues that we need to think about going forward. So please join me in thanking our panelists.